Good morning, friends. Thank you for being here with us this morning. This is episode 14 of Fire for Effect. I'm here with John Jones, and my name is Marcus Moyer. As you know, if you've ever tuned into any of our podcasts before, we typically have a pretty colorful cast of characters that join us routinely, but we are kind of spread out across the country, and we have different vocations and things going on in our lives. John is a farmer and a musician. I'm a government contractor that works at the Pentagon after retiring from the Marine Corps last year. James McBride is a city councilman down in Charleston, and he and his wife are on a vacation right now. Pastor Mike Pedlow out west, I believe, and Taylor George, an attorney down in Florida. So John Jones and I were the only ones who could make it this morning. So thank you for being here with us. Hopefully it'll be a good, I know it will be a good discussion, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as we do. John, how are things in North Carolina?
Oh man, Marcus, I'm looking at beautiful fall weather this morning. I'm sorry that they left you scraping the bottom of the barrel here, and you have to put up with just little old me this morning. But I think you and I can do a pretty good job of holding up a conversation based on our past uh, meetings and whatnot. I think we'll have plenty to get into. But overall, just a very thankful guy here on this Friday morning. I hope you are as well.
Very much. Could not ask for better weather here in Northern Virginia. Not a cloud in the sky. The sun is out. The leaves are changing. The wind is stirring. It is a beautiful, beautiful day. Great day to be alive.
You bet.
And it can never be said that we lived in uninteresting times. I'm sure it's the same in North Carolina, but I know here in Virginia, things are hopping. As I mentioned on the last episode, the election is in full swing. The early voting stuff, and it kind of goes to what I'm hoping to talk about today. Is that if you look around the world, if you're only halfway paying attention, there's so many concerning things geopolitically, spiritually, and in our personal lives. You know, we're all grateful for the ceasefire and the beginnings of a peace agreement in the Middle East, but literally, like before the ink was dry on phase one of that agreement, Hamas is executing people in the streets. That's disappointing and very disturbing. And then, the war in Ukraine is still ongoing. Here at home, we're still in a government shutdown. Our politicians can't seem to get it together. You've got one half of the aisle who's lobbying for just some ridiculous things and holding the American public hostage as a result. We've got, political turmoil and strife and controversy, hate, threats that are swirling, in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. You'd think that sort of thing would taper off, but at least here in Virginia, it hasn't. We have at least two of our elected officials or candidates who have entered into that kind of rhetoric. It's disappointing, not only to hear that type of speech being used, but the fact that other people won't step up and condemn it and ask them to step away and step aside. It has no place in our American government, and certainly not as the top cop, the top lawyer, the attorney general in Virginia. But anyway, all of those things, and then of course in our personal lives, everybody has something going on. We all experience storms, trials, and tribulations, and so it's very easy and tempting for people to get discouraged. It's very easy to let this sense of hopelessness creep in to our lives, almost to the point of paralysis. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I hear it a lot, even in church, where people there's this hint, this tone of resignation in their voice, where they've given up. They think that it's over, and they're just going to hang on until Jesus comes back to get us, which I look forward to that day too. But we can't just go hands off between now and then. And so this idea of hopelessness and hope, where does hope come from? What causes hopelessness? Where does hope come from, and how do we restore it and maintain it? It's kind of where I want to go with the discussion today.
What a discussion that can lead to, and I've observed so much of the same thing, mostly from the church angle that you mentioned. I'm notoriously bad at not keeping up with what's going on in national and global news. Honestly, it adds so much stress to me that I at some point had to turn it off. And it not coincidentally though, um, what seemed to work better for me to get a grasp on what's going on in the world right now, rather than staying in tune with the current events, I found that going back and reading history actually helped me have a better grasp of what's going on right now. If I look at what's going on right now, my head's spinning. I can't keep up with it. And I'm not saying nobody should look at current events. This is just me talking about how I operate day to day. I can't keep up with the headlines and the latest what is that? Is it called a ticker tape thing down at the bottom of the screen? All that. My dad used to love watching Fox News. Bless him. I'm glad he could do that, but I never could. It's just too much. It overwhelmed me. But now I loved reading about like the Jacksonian era in this nation where, if we think the world's falling apart now, back then in that era, they were sure, oh no, this guy that they've just elected in office, this is the end for sure. They thought America itself was done. And if we read history enough, we see over and over again we've kind of been here before. I mean, maybe not these exact circumstances, but it's been this bad or worse in the past. You know, we I hope I'm not, calling down the thunder here or anything. We haven't seen like the Black Plague or anything like that in our nation. So, we really don't have a grasp on how bad things can get. It's just that our comfort has been threatened, mostly I think is what a lot of people deal with. And I don't know how far you want me to keep running with this, but that's what I think is that's the tell sign right there of where we put our hope. If you want to talk about hope, um, what you put your hope in, when it gets threatened, that exposes what you're putting your hope in. I guess I don't know if I'm wording that correctly, but if you don't know what you're putting your hope in, let that area of your life be threatened. Meaning, if you're putting all your hope in, your financial status at the end of the year, or if you're putting all your hope in a pharmaceutical drug or the government or even military might, let those things be threatened, and that reveals really quickly where you're putting your hopes. And I'm sure you and I and everybody watching this podcast experienced that during the pandemic and the shutdown. Everything we had put our hopes in that would be just the same tomorrow as it always has been, all of a sudden that stuff was threatened. And so I guess everybody was having to reevaluate what we put our hope in. And maybe I'll pitch this concept, and then I'll let you take it, Marcus. I initially thought of hope and considered it and tried to figure out what hope meant by trying to figure out, what is the opposite of hope. And my first impulse was to say fear, but I'm not sure that would be correct. And I'll pitch this to you. I think possibly the opposite of hope is complacency. And maybe we could even say that every person in this world is either in the category of hope or complacency, one or the other. Because, I mean, hope doesn't necessarily mean you're hoping for in the right things, trusting in the right things, but you're hoping for something, hoping something will change. Whereas if you're complacent, you've sold yourself on the idea that this is it. This is as far as it goes. This is as good as it gets, or as bad as it gets, either one. So, I'll pitch that question to you. Do you think I'm anywhere near accurate in saying that the two contrasts are either hope or complacency? I'll let you run with that, Marcus.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of them as direct contrast before, but I think you might be right. Or there might be one step in between, because a lack of hope certainly leads to complacency. If you feel like you can't do anything, if you feel like you're helpless, then that tends to lead to doing nothing. And so I don't know if there's a direct link there, or if maybe the opposite of hope is doubt, and then doubt leads to complacency. Normally we think of doubt as being the opposite of faith, But as we'll talk about here in a little bit, there's a strong tie, there's a strong connection between hope and faith. I don't think it's any accident, when we read First Corinthians 13, that it says, now but by the faith, hope, and charity. I think those things are grouped together for a reason.
Yeah.
But I do think you're onto something there, that in an absence of hope breeds complacency. And, from a military perspective, intelligence operations, psychological operations, obviously if you could, in a perfect world, if you could achieve it, you want your enemy to do nothing. You want them to sit still in the perfect place where you can hit them. Most times you can't convince your enemy to do nothing. So the next best thing is convince them to do the wrong thing. And hopelessness has the ability to do both of those things. In an ambush, for example, if you're ever ambushed, the worst thing you can do is freeze in the kill zone. But fear will do that to you if you're not trained to do otherwise, and then you're just a sitting duck. And so a saying, if you will, on a battlefield, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing you can do is the wrong thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. And so in an absence of hope, doubt, complacency, despair, it leads us to do nothing, which is the absolute worst thing that we could do. And so you hit on exactly the thing that I wanted to bring up. The opposite of hope, hopelessness. What causes hopelessness? One, which we've kind of already touched on a little bit, is perceived injustices in the world. When you look around and you see bad people getting away with bad things, it seems like there's no justice in the world. That was a common question that's asked in Scripture. Why do the wicked prosper? And that in itself could be a long discussion, not for today. But it's frustrating to good people to see bad people get away with being bad. And that causes us to start to question things and starts to put dents in our hope. But the second thing is this perception of helplessness that breeds hopelessness. Helplessness equals hopelessness, I think. And you were talking about how you intentionally stay away from national news. And I thought it was super interesting that you mentioned that, and you and I didn't talk about that before. But I think national news is one of the main reasons people feel helpless and therefore hopeless.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, it's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And it's written by a man named Neil Postman a number of years ago. And this was his perspective on national news. He said that many Americans are enamored with national politics, but have little understanding of what is happening in their own city and county. This is largely a function of the media we consume, he says. The result is that we are all painfully aware of events that are well beyond our immediate ability to affect, but almost ignorant of those that are within easy reach of our individual and collective influence. In chapter 5 of that book, he describes an information age phenomenon that has resulted in news from nowhere, addressed to no one in particular, crisscrossing the nation, and in a sea of information, there is very little of it that you can use. He went on to say that the swirl of information flow made the country into a neighborhood, but it was a peculiar one, populated by strangers who knew nothing but the most superficial facts about each other. And then Postman holds that information derives its importance from the possibilities of action. And he observed that most of our news is inert, consisting of information that gives us something to talk about, but cannot lead to any meaningful action.
Right.
And the resulting disconnect between information and action has led us into an era of diminished social and political potency. In other words, feeling helpless. He says you might get a sense of what this means by asking yourself a series of questions. What steps do you plan to take to reduce the conflict in the Middle East? Or the rates of inflation, or crime, or unemployment? What are your plans for preserving the environment or reducing the risk of nuclear war? What do you plan to do about NATO, OPEC, or the CIA? He said, I'll take the liberty of answering for you. You plan to do nothing about them. You may, of course, cast a ballot for somebody who claims to have some plans as well as the power to act, but that is something that you can only do once every 2 or 4 years by giving an hour or so of your time, which is hardly a satisfying means of expressing the broad range of opinions you hold. The news elicits from you a variety of opinions about which you can do nothing except to offer them as more news about which you can do nothing. And in the information world, the sense of potency was lost precisely because the whole world became the context for news. We were sent information which answered no question we had asked, and which, in any case, did not permit the right of a reply.
Man, there's just so much there that you could, you could pause and you could pull so much from that wisdom, or that insight, maybe I should say. And I think often about how much human nature just craves an opportunity to be a victim. And there's something, I'll say, sinfully gratifying or rewarding about watching the news and just saying, "Oh, it's all bad, and there's nothing I can do, nothing we can do. We're all just sheep to the slaughter." I don't quite have a grasp on why we do that, but there's in my own thinking and in everybody I know, the most noble person I could know probably has something in life that they want to say that, well, it's just unfair circumstances. I can't do anything about it, and I would speak to, if we're talking about the news telling us how bad things are in our society, and our first thought is we can't do anything, but just like the authors you were quoting there, we got to figure out what little things we can do. Um, for example, well, I was actually thinking of two different examples here. For a couple of years, several years back, I went and I trained in jujitsu because that's what the cool thing was to do for a while there. And I found that whenever you're rolling or wrestling, working out with a bigger opponent, they want to get on top of you and dominate you and make you feel smothered like there's nothing you can do. You're hopeless right there. But what you learn in jujitsu is to make these little adjustments, not trying to completely push your opponent off of you, because you're going to completely find out that doesn't work. You don't have the strength to do it. You can't change it all. But you make these small adjustments where you can, and the next thing you know, you've got a little room to breathe. You've created a little space. It buys you just a little bit more leverage. And if you stay with that long enough, you learn how to work yourself out of those positions where you don't feel smothered. So that was a great opportunity for me to learn how to do that, not just in jujitsu, but in life in general. If you start to feel smothered or oppressed by this huge opponent in life, okay, stop and look at what small areas can I make adjustments in that I don't feel so outgunned, outweighed, and the other parallel I was thinking about with that is, okay, maybe I can't do anything about gun violence, these school shootings, as far as the nation goes, but I can teach my kids to respect firearms. I can teach them gun safety. In other words, what can we do at our house, in our family? And that's, I guess you'd call that a grassroots movement. And we've seen where these grassroots movements definitely make a difference in the long run, in the big picture of things. But anytime you're facing an opponent, an oppressor, an adversary, their absolute favorite place for you to be is in a place where you think you can't do anything. They want you to feel, your adversary is going to want you to feel like you don't have any more options, you don't have any leverage, and so we have to keep in mind that when we're facing evil, there is an author of all that evil, and he wants us to not think in hopeful ways. He doesn't want us to think we have a way out or a way through, a way around any of the stuff that we're facing. But we can buy into that, or we can just start looking for those little ways to create space, make a little leverage, make a little room, and it may be a game of inches for a while. We're doing all these little adjustments, but you got to create some momentum, and I think that's the best way to start is by making small adjustments. Um, and this topic of hope has been one that's on my mind a lot lately. So hopefully that was speaking to some of that, and I'll turn that back over to you.
Oh man, that is so good. That analogy with martial arts is spot on, spot on. And I think there's this unholy alliance of human nature from the governing class and the governed. It's obviously in the interest, or of the governing class to convince people that they're helpless and they need to just sit back and let the elites take care of everything. And it really preys on a part of human nature that is lazy.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
if I am helpless, then I don't have to do anything. I can't do anything if I convince myself that I can't, right? And so I think sometimes this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness is almost self-imposed, or it's at least it's enlarged beyond its true proportions, and people use that as an excuse to sit back and do nothing,
Yes.
to be complacent. Because I've heard that in my own circles at church and even in my own family, not my personal family here, but my extended family. It's like, well, yeah, I agree things are bad, but I don't know what I could do about it. And I happen to serve on the electoral board here in Prince William County, and so I've got all kinds of ideas of what people could do. I was a precinct captain for a while, helped turn out poll watchers and election officers and things like that. And so anytime somebody tells me I don't know what to do, I very quickly give them a list of times and places and dates where they can be somewhere and do a thing. And 90% of the people never show up. And so I'm not convinced that they truly want to do anything about it. They just use the fact, or the feeling, I should say, that they can't as an excuse to not do
Yeah.
anything. And as you were saying, it's not true that there's nothing we can do, even if it's just influencing your own family and your own small sphere of influence. And that matters a lot more than we give it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
But this years and years of reducing the importance of the individual, um, marginalizing the power of the individual and the value of the individual, and emphasizing collectivism has brought us to this point. And convincing the public that only great men can make a difference, and therefore you and me, who are not great men, have to sit back and wait for some great man to come along and save us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think back to George Washington, who's a revered hero of the American Revolution, and rightly so. But I read recently that there were about 250 battles fought during the Revolutionary War, and General Washington fought in just 17 of those battles. And of those 17, he only won 6 of them. So to say that George Washington won the revolution is not true. He was absolutely an important leader, in the movement. But the victory and our independence was not won just by George Washington. It was won by local, ordinary individuals
Absolutely.
coming together and defending their families and their friends and their neighbors and their homes, and often doing so under the direction and organization of their local pastor, by the way. So this perception of insignificance, of not mattering, it's a lie, and it's not a valid reason to feel hopeless. We just have to come to grips with that,
Completely. And I think you'll be able to add some numbers to what I was trying to recall. I want to think it's the 6% rule. And that was basically, if you want to affect change within an organization, you really only need about 6% of that organization to be on board with that change to really initiate change. Meaning that, what I'm trying to connect the dots here on is, you might say, well, I'm just little old me. I'm outnumbered by the masses, by a far larger adversary. They got strength in numbers and what have you. We're in fact, and if you want to talk about the American Revolution, what was it? Less than 20% of Americans were actually in favor,
I
which
think
was,
it was 3%. 3% that were actively involved in the war effort.
yeah, that's even more meaningful, isn't it? I mean, it shows over and over again. Strength in numbers is not a hard fast rule. It's really about your core, I think, group of who's really dedicated to initiating change. So trying to keep this all in the context of hope. If we're waiting to be hopeful until we have the right numbers and everything is proportionate and we think we're going to win because of our outnumbering the opposition, I think we're going about it all wrong. I think we need to just do again what we can, where we can, when we can. Um, and and one of the things I both loved and hated about about learning all this for myself was it really helped me personally identify the areas in life where I was really just wanting to uh, be heard fussing and complaining. I guess that's the nicer way to say it. Or was I really committed to change? And I really wanted to see something done. And so for me personally, I was able to identify some areas in life where, no, I just really want to fuss about that. I want somebody else to fix it, and but then there were some areas, where I was moved deeply. I'll use my farm endeavors as an example. I live in a pretty heavily ag focused area of eastern North Carolina, and I love the farm community, the farmers. I see so much that I appreciate and respect, but I saw that way of life threatened. And so I kind of started looking at what is going on, and there was a very real sense of hopelessness there because you talk about big numbers, everything from the amount of acreage to the political influence to the money you have to borrow even to get into conventional farming. And yeah, I felt really hopeless in that situation. And then somehow I think through my younger brother, he referred this guy's name to me, Joel Salatin. If anybody's interested in looking that guy up, he is very, very present on the internet. You probably already heard of him. But he started this movement of a unique approach to raising food that brought with it a sense of hope to me for people like me who maybe didn't have the resources to jump into farming in an industrial way. But there's a hope there that, hey, I can actually do something with just my small resources. I can initiate some change. And so this was one of the areas where I was not content to just gripe and say somebody ought to do something about that. I felt this was important enough for me to actually get in the trenches and get my hands dirty. I didn't come from a farming family at all. It was just something that was on my heart that this is worth looking like an idiot for. This is worth getting my hands dirty. This is worth working more hours and really trying to affect some change. And I found in this that embracing the hope that I can make a change, it is something you have to nurture all the time because everything we try to do is always going to be easily blown off course if you're not really committed to hopefulness, really being hopeful that this is a worthy venture, that this is something we can do something about. Because much like you said, we're told all the time, we need a big superhero to come and change these things. We can't do it. No, that's silly. Somebody else has got to do it. And maybe one more quick reference here and then I'll turn it back over to you. Kind of cool coincidence that I think in a conversation you and Jim McBride and myself were having recently about the Constitution. we're like, well, I hope somebody's managing that Constitution thing because there's nothing I can do about it, right? That depends on somebody else, but that's not true. We each are responsible for doing something about the Constitution, and that's how we stay hopeful. We're doing something. We're living out those principles that were included in the Constitution, and that right there is acting on hope. It's not just saying, "I hope somebody will come rescue us soon." It's being hopeful, I believe.
Yeah, 100%. And your revelation in the farming world, you know, for me, it was elections. After the 2020 election and all of the allegations that the election was stolen and that our elections are rigged and the election system is broken and it's so easy to cheat. I watched all of that happen, and I had some concerns. And so my solution to that was, well, I'm not in Congress, I'm not at the state level, but here in Prince William County, we have an electoral board that oversees the elections for our county and that oversees the registrar's office and the office of elections. And so I don't know if what they're claiming happened in Michigan and in Arizona and in Pennsylvania. Like, I don't know if that happened in Virginia, but there's only one way to find out. And so I got onto the electoral board, and now I get to help oversee the elections in Virginia. So I kind of get to see behind the curtain and have a lot of questions that I had answered, and hopefully answer those same questions for other people who are now hearing the answer from somebody that they know and trust, not some talking head on national news, on Fox or CNN or whatever they watch. And so I think that is the answer, individuals getting involved at the local level. We should pay attention to national politics, but as Postman pointed out, there's not a lot you can do about it other than vote your values, whenever you have the opportunity. But there are things you can do at the local level, and that we should do.
Yeah.
There's another good book written by retired Army Colonel John Mills. It's called "The Nation Will Follow," and the whole premise of the book is that if we all focus on securing our counties, the nation will follow. And of course, that makes logical sense. And when you talk about, getting control of your local electoral board, your local registrar's office, and we're very fortunate here in Virginia and Prince William County, I would add, but getting control of that, making sure you have a good sheriff and that you have a good mayor or a city council or board of county supervisors, however your local government is constructed, a good governor and a good attorney general. If you can get your county and your state taken under control, then the nation is taken care of by default. So it's very good. So this perceived insignificance, this perception that we as individuals are completely helpless and therefore can't affect anything. Again, another lie that leads to unnecessary hopelessness, I would say. The next thing that I would offer that causes hopelessness is perceived futility. And this is one that I think is dangerous, because exceptionally dangerous, because it can even affect people who, like you and me and others, are trying to do things as individuals. And the reason it's dangerous is because we may already be very active, very involved in many good and worthy causes, and yet we seemingly see little or no result or positive movement despite all of our efforts. Maybe we even experience what we see as failure, and that can quickly lead to discouragement and a sense of helplessness. This idea of, what's the use?
Yeah.
I'm doing everything that I know how to do, and it still doesn't seem to make a difference. I'm not making any headway. I'm not even moving the needle. And so when you've got the people who are involved, who start to question the viability of their involvement, that is extremely dangerous. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't ever struggle with it.
For sure. Yeah. And maybe, I guess my mind goes to how we in our society, especially, we're trained to keep score from such a young age, and we have this idea that somebody is watching over our shoulder, keeping score every moment. And if you're not doing the magic thing that absolutely solves the equation, then you're not getting a high score. But I think this probably goes back to what you were saying earlier about the rule in combat, is that the main thing is just do something. Yeah, you're going to do the wrong thing probably because you happen to be human, but do something. Get out there and I do myself. I struggle with the futility issue quite a bit, and I sometimes feel like there's probably people that look at my life like some of the things I'm doing are kind of silly. In the I'll go back to my farm endeavors. I've got 17 acres that I'm trying to convert into raising our own food. And regenerative ag. 17 acres in the grand scheme of what's going on in the food production in our society, that can seem futile for sure. But I think that's where you find out how much you really love something, how really sold out you are to making a difference in your own life. I'll also maybe use my guitar students, my music students, not just guitar, especially the ones who are retired age. They they sometimes reveal things in their conversations with me that they feel kind of like silly or like this is futile trying to learn something new at this stage in life. I think that is how we're kind of trained. Like, hey, if you didn't do something in your prime, if you're not doing it to become an absolute success, if you're not some naturally gifted wonder kid, then you're futile. No, I completely disagree with and reject all of that. I think just doing something and then sticking to it and determining that you're going to nourish this thing in your life as much as you can, that really that'll tell you how much that'll reveal how much you really love this whatever you're trying to accomplish in life. And I'll um I'll also like to mention that I completely admire and respect your willingness to jump into the political I guess arena, and even just in your local elections and whatnot. That's highly admirable. I think it was Mark Lamb, if you're familiar with him. They called him the American Sheriff. What an outstanding guy he is. I read his book, and he said they have a saying around their house that if you ever want to know how many wrong things you've done in life, get into politics, and somebody will point out every wrong thing you've ever done in life for you. They'll make it very clear. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
they
highly
say they
respect your
say
will.
clear conscience is a sure sign of a bad memory.
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so curious to me how easily we're dissuaded by just kind of ridiculous sayings that we've come to accept as ancient wisdom, like you can't teach an old dog new tricks,
Oh yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and that's so silly. Of course you can. I'm not old, but I'm not young, but I can still be taught things. I can still learn things, and I want to learn things. I want to be learning things until the day I die, even if I live to be 100.
Yes.
And you're still teachable at any age.
Yes.
And the importance of what you talked about there of you know even if it feels like you're not getting anywhere, you got to keep going. You'd referred back to the military saying I had mentioned earlier, and it reminded me of the song that who's it Rodney Atkins, is that his name?
There is a Rodney
I'm
Atkins.
pretty- Yeah, the song that he's not like. Don't take your theology from this song, but it's applicable to what we're talking about here. When he talks about if you're going through hell, just keep going. Don't slow down, and if you're afraid, don't show it. Just keep going because you might get out before the devil even knows you're there, or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So you're going through a hard time, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, and you're doing all the things you can think of, and you're not moving the needle, keep going. Keep going.
I think I'm in the right place. We just referenced a country song in our discussion of the principle of hope here. So I'm in the right place here in this discussion this morning, I think.
Well, I have a habit of doing that even in the Sunday school class that I teach. So it's kind of a joke. Um, I have to preface every illustration with, "I've never heard this song before, but I've heard about it."
Yeah. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. I wanted to mention one more thing. I had brought up Sheriff Mark Lamb, and you mentioned earlier the importance of a county sheriff, and I think he was the first one that really highlighted that for me. I know a lot of people were probably already aware of this, but he was the one during the COVID pandemic shutdown out in Arizona who basically told the federal government what he would or would not enforce in his county. And that just was a light bulb moment for me of how important it is to get out and vote in the local elections. I had never voted in a local election before. I only, would go out for the presidential election, but that changed everything for me. And then I actually had the opportunity. It was kind of cool to Sheriff Mark Lamb came here to North Carolina and did a speech, a rally. A rally is what I was looking for the local GOP here. And I was asked to come and play music for that event, and I did. And I got to stay and listen to his presentation. What a solid individual! I got a couple of his books. I was not by any means disappointed. If anybody has ever been a voice of hope in this society and this age, he definitely is. I mean, he was on the front lines fighting drug cartels in Arizona, and whenever he was asked about the people he dealt with every day, you would think he would say, "Oh, it's horrible. They're the worst of society, yada yada." His response was actually, "You know what? 90% of the people I deal with are just good people who have made some bad decisions." He said, "Yeah, there's some bad ones out there we got to deal with, but his whole outlook was so very founded on a hopeful viewpoint of what we're going through and how to deal with things. He really inspired me a lot to step back from what I hear about. Things are going to get worse before they get better, and the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. And like you mentioned earlier, we hear that talk in church. I don't know how many times from the pulpit I hear preachers talking about, look at the world around you, how bad it's getting, how bad it's getting. And for me, as a dad with 3 young kids, I don't want to teach my kids, look how bad things are. It's only going to get worse. That's not healthy, I think, to plant that kind of seed in our young people's minds. Is it wise to tell them everything's hunky dory? Of course not. But I think the more important thing is to start telling them where you can find hope instead of, pointing out where there isn't hope. Why would we make that the main theme of our, our soapbox? Let's focus on where the hope is instead of where it isn't.
Yeah, we as Christians will often default, to the verse in Scripture. In the last days, perilous times will come, and of course, that's true. It's Scripture, and perilous times are here. But perilous times have been here before. As you said, as you mentioned earlier, and as Solomon pointed out, there's nothing new under the sun. So I have no way of knowing whether today's perilous times are the last and that we are in the last days. I have no way of knowing that. And neither does anybody else. And Jesus said, nobody knows the time or the day that this is going to happen. And so we have an obligation as Christians to be hope in dark times. And because there is such a pervasive spirit of helplessness and hopelessness, it's why people like Sheriff Lamb stand out. Anybody who can offer any kind of hope, people flock to them. That's why Trump was so popular. And so you're absolutely right. Teaching our children to be, um, what's the phrase? Wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. Like, don't be oblivious to the dangers of the world that you live in, but don't be overcome by them either. Um, and learn to be that hope that people are looking for. Um, because it leads us to the next factor, I think, that causes a lot of hopelessness is that people feel like they're alone, that they're isolated, that they're the only one who thinks or feels the way they do. And it's interesting to me that in the information technology age that we live in, people are more connected than they've ever been at any point in history, and yet many have never felt more alone. And that's an interesting dichotomy for me. And this feeling of isolation leads to feeling of anxiety, depression, helplessness, and hopelessness. And I don't think it's an accident that humanity seems to be being herded in that direction. And it's not having a good effect. Symptoms of Living reported that the World Health Organization, which I'm not a huge fan of, but the World Health Organization states that at any one time, over 300 million people have depression, which is approximately 4% of the world's population. Depression is the leading global disability and is the 10th leading cause of early death. At Alert Health noted that depression is most common in young adults aged 18 to 25, which is fascinating. And as many as 30.9% of survey respondents experienced symptoms of depression due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we know, was a result of lockdowns and very strict hospital and nursing home restrictions, resulting in intense feelings of isolation and loneliness for many people, young and old. And every day, approximately 110 Americans take their own life, and about 3,500 more attempt to do that. So all from feelings of isolation, anxiety, depression, helpless, and hopeless.
Yeah, the point that you made there, the irony of our internet age, our digital age, that we can connect with other people um, so easily and so readily, and yet somehow it's not fixing things. I guess this is kind of the same. I guess this is kind of the same principle as we would take on firearms. It's the gun is not. It's not evil, and it's also not the remedy. It's the person holding that tool as that will determine the outcome of how it's used. Same thing with the internet. The internet is not going to fix us. It's about the individual and how they use this internet. And I have to think, and I'm going to put my conspiracy theory hat on here. I have to think that because most of our internet social media platforms are not um, maintained or even developed by Christian loving people, that the way it's designed is not meant uh, to help people. It's more meant to control them. And like I said, my conspiracy theory hat is on here, but I'm thinking back of this is going way back, and I'm using secondhand info here. So anybody listening, feel free to comment if this is all off, but I think I've got this story right. Way, 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 way back in history. I think the guy's name who invented radio was by the name of Marconi. Marcus, I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not, but whenever he invented the radio, he took it to the church, to the leading church organizations of the era. And he said, "Look, I've got, this radio frequency thing we can use, I'm bringing it to you." And they rejected it. They rejected. Nope, nope, we don't like this. It's, they probably called it worldly or what have you. And so of course, Marconi went elsewhere, and we'll say the secular world, they're like, yeah, we'll use that radio. You bet. We can use that for a lot of our agendas, and they have, and from radio, you can use the same, I guess, principle over into TV and then into internet. And I would love to know maybe like an alternative history here. What if the church had been the first one to embrace media like radio or TV or our social media platforms right now? What if godly minded people had been the first ones to invent these things? Would we see the same results in this rampant depression that you're talking about? Because I have a feeling that if the intentions of and motives of the people building these social media platforms were God honoring, we would see much better fruit from it. But because those intentions are probably not God honoring, and because the people using the internet are mostly um, brought up in a society that is not encouraging them to think godly thoughts, all of those things are just resulting in more and more depression and anxiety. I think that's where my thoughts are going anyhow. If you have anything to speak to in any of that.
I think you're probably right. And I've observed the same thing. The church is extremely slow to embrace even useful technology.
Mm-hmm.
And because we are so far out of phase and we lag behind so much, the world often runs circles around the church, and it's no wonder that we struggle. Like I thought it was amazing that we've been ever since Jesus returned, ever since he ascended to heaven and he left those last instructions with the disciples and with the church. Um, Go and teach everybody, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, to the entire world. And we're still struggling. There are still places on this planet where people have never heard the word of Jesus.
Yes.
And I found it interesting that in 2020, during the height of COVID, the message of COVID just stormed the planet in a matter of days, weeks, months. And I doubt, except in maybe the most remote corners of Africa and South America, I doubt there's a person on the planet who doesn't know what COVID is.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened in less than a year. And we've been trying for 2,000 years as the church to spread the message of Jesus Christ, and we haven't done it yet. And we haven't used the tools. How did they reach everybody with their COVID message? They use things that the church would never dream of using, and it's why we're failing.
What is the old saying about how bad news rides a fast horse or something of that nature? I can't remember exactly, but
Well, I
yeah.
think Mark Twain talked about truth and a lie, how a lie can make a lap around the earth while the truth is getting its shoes on, or something like that.
Yeah, that very similar sentiment there, I think. Um, yeah, and I think all of this is falling under the umbrella of hope, and I'm trying not to get too far off of that with where I'm going to go here, but you kind of brought up something that I couldn't help but um kind of wander through my thinking while I was contemplating hope. And you referred to this earlier about our scriptures that combines faith, hope, and charity. And you mentioned spreading the gospel. And at some point in my life, I was trying to figure out. Some people might call this a silly question, but I had to ask it myself. That's what I do. I ask questions. But I had to ask, why do we need to share the gospel? What is the point behind that? Because and this is going to sound a bit harsh, but the way that I was seeing that through a local church lens was that we were trying to get our numbers up, and it's kind of like Well, all the cool kids are joining this club, so you should too, right? And that's kind of how I thought it was being presented, and maybe it is in some situations. I don't know. I'm not trying to really point fingers at anybody for that. I'm just talking about my own, trying to get down to the root of this. Why do we need to share the hope of the gospel? And I think, and in that scripture, of course, it talks about the greatest of these three is charity. And I know a lot of times we use the word love in place of charity, but I think, and I'm glad you used charity earlier, because I think it's important to bring that word charity back into the original usage, because if we really do love like God is in us, we want to share this life and this hope with other people. And it's not about how many people we share it with. It's not like God's up there tallying, okay, whenever I make the second coming of Christ happen, he's going to have 75,000 people on his side. I know there's numbers mentioned like in the Revelation of St. John, but I think that was more for symbolic value than anything. And really, God is just saying, if you really have a spirit of love, you can't help but want to share this hope, and where you're finding something to have hope in and have faith based on. And I've talked to my Sunday school class before. If you say, you found, for example, a new pair of shoes, and they're just like really good to you, and you love them, in a loose sense, you kind of want to share that with somebody else who is having some problems with their feet, maybe, or something. But if you really love, if you have real love, it has that sense of charity to it, and you want to give to someone else, and you want them to have hope. And I'll turn it back over to you, but by finishing saying, I read this morning somebody said that kind of a distinction between faith and hope is that faith is whenever we stop and we look at the cross, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Hope is more about that final reckoning that we're all mindful of, that will bring with it that revelation. A friend of mine recently said, we talk about the book of Revelation and we get all these dramatic, world's going to end kind of thing. He said the word revelation simply means to reveal. He said in that day that, basically Jesus is coming back to reveal himself and the truth of probably what's right here in front of us in the first place, and the goodness of the Lord. And so, we should want to share that. And maybe if we don't, maybe if we're thinking that, I made my profession and I'm just going to sit on the pews every now and then, maybe we need to really re-examine our own sense of what love and charity is, and do we really have hope? And I think if any of these three are out of whack, it affects the other two principles. Your love, your faith, and your hope, or your charity, your faith, and your hope should all, I guess, work together as a whole and produce that willingness and that desire to share with others.
That's spot on. And it's a great segue into the next section, which is where hope comes from. And you already identified the primary source of hope, and it leads to our commission as Christians to introduce that hope to a world that is without hope. We could get into the clinical definitions of what hope is, and there are clinical definitions. Science recognizes the importance of hope. If you were to just Google it or ask, ChatGPT what hope is, it would give you a long definition of, the psychological, emotional, and spiritual factors that are rooted in a human experience of belief. And so there's scientific data behind the value of hope, but they still don't really know where it comes from.
Interesting.
That is, yeah, and that is something that the Bible has the answer to. And hope is actually a person. And you'd mentioned the connection between faith and hope. We read in Scripture that faith is the substance of things hoped for, but faith in what? 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18 through 21 talks about, speaks of our redemption not through corruptible things, but with the precious blood of Christ, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who by him do believe in God that raised him up from the dead and gave him glory, that your faith and hope might be in God. And it's exactly what you were saying. We read elsewhere in Scripture to be of good courage, and he will strengthen your heart, all ye that hope in the Lord. And then you were talking earlier about finding comfort in the fact that no matter how bad things are, it won't and can't last forever, and we should keep going in those times. There's hope in that. Lamentations in chapter 3, one of my favorite verses. This I recall to mind, and therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And I find great hope and encouragement in those verses, this bond between faith and hope. Chaplain Cash, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a rear admiral, the senior chaplain in Navy and Marine Corps. And he was quoting somebody, and he said, "Faith is the art of holding on to things that your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods." And he was addressing mental health in this video that he had made. And he said, in the military, we often hear that hope is not a strategy. Hope is not a course of action. But he said, let me gently push back on that and say that hope is everything. If we lose hope, we lose everything.
I was just, yeah, that brought about a little aha there. I enjoyed that. That was good words.
And so how do we, to close this out, how do we create, restore, and maintain hope? Obviously going to the source that we just talked about, but there are a couple of other things that I think we should keep in mind to maintain or maybe even restore our hope if we feel like we've lost it. One is we have to identify our purpose. And I was reading recently a book by W.J. Dawson called The Making of a Man, and he said that this kind of coincides with what we were talking about, great men, people who have been able to make change. He said, we can all measure the outward triumph of a man's life, but we rarely measure the forces out of which the triumph sprang. Men suddenly emerge into the blaze of fame, and then the world wakes up and wonders how it all happened. There's no such thing as luck in a world over which God presides. What then is the secret? It's purpose. The great victories which men praise are always won first of all in a man's own soul. The great men who stamp themselves ineffaceably on the ages are always men who are capable of conceiving a purpose clearly and following it courageously through evil and good report. You may even sweep aside as relatively trivial all questions of the range of their gifts, the scope of their intellectual life. The great force with which you have to reckon is the immense strength and heroic persistency of their purpose. So finding a purpose will restore hope. Purpose and a sense of duty keeps us anchored and driven.
Such good words. I was reminded of one of my favorite writers, and I sometimes catch some flack for this, but Ralph Waldo Emerson is a favorite of mine, and he says that shallow men believe in luck. Strong men know that fortunes are not exceptions, but fruit. And I thought that was really that hit me at a good time in life, probably 20 years ago or so, because you get to thinking, if you're not the wonder kid or what have you, then you don't really have a chance, or you don't have a purpose or what have you. But we each have a purpose, and I was thinking too about how I always bring this up to my Sunday school classes. Um, how do we talk about this with somebody who's not ready to embrace Christianity, and who's not ready for the whole godly purpose thing, because sometimes we're guilty of just we've been in this for a while, so we want everybody else to take the whole kit and caboodle right off the bat. But maybe I think hope could be one of the most unifying ways to bring a conversation to a good place, just asking an individual who is clearly on the opposite side of your moral issues or whatever, you know, what are your hopes, and what are you putting your hopes in, and not in a condescending way, but really asking ourselves to, all right, let's look at what am I really putting my confidence and my trust in. And you know as we mentioned before, when we had the pandemic, the shutdown, we saw a lot of things that we put our hope and confidence in were easily taken from us in the blink of an eye. And a lot of people can relate to that. And maybe, just kind of discussing that, and revealing how, at least, maybe kind of encouraging people to think about how when you put your hope and your trust in a dollar bill, a promotion, or maybe a trip to Tahiti you think is going to make things better, or another person you're going to get married to, when you put all your hope and all that stuff, you're bound to be disappointed every time. And so, eventually, hopefully, we can encourage people to find their hope in something beyond what the material world is going to provide us. And I think that's where I'll have to leave off about hope. But I think that's as important as anything, is that we can use hope to find common ground with people who otherwise will just reject a lot of what we want to say. You know, I think human beings are the only creatures on this planet that have hope. Animals are just doing what animals do every day, but we have hopes, and and maybe that speaks to your mention of purpose. We have a purpose as the humans on this earth.
I think you're right. That is a great common point to start with people who maybe even aren't believers. Everybody has hopes and dreams. And then, as you go through that investigation of your own hopes and your own dreams, inevitably you'll come to the conclusion that, unless you're a believer, that your hopes and dreams kind of end with you. And there's an end. There's no eternal purpose in your life that you've recognized yet. And so I think that's a great way to lead people toward the truth. So having a purpose, for sure, and then preparation is a way of maintaining and restoring hope. Because a lot of people, maybe they're not even sure exactly what their purpose is just yet. And I would encourage folks, if they find themselves in that place, don't be idle while you're figuring it out.
Hmm.
That stagnation. Prepare yourself. What most people call luck is really just the intersection of preparation and opportunity. Going back to what W.J. Dawson said, there's no such thing as luck in any world over which God presides. And so Winston Churchill actually said something very profound. He said a lot of profound things, but he said to each person there comes a time in their life, a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered a chance to do something very special, unique to them and fitted to their talents. And what a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which would have been their finest hour. So taking advantage of the time that we're given to prepare, even if we don't really understand fully what we're preparing for, but prepare for the purpose.
I'll make one maybe suggestion for anybody who is, maybe asking the question, well, how do I prepare? I heard somebody say, and I think this is pretty solid. Heard somebody say once, if you don't know what your purpose is specifically, look around for somebody who seems to know what their purpose is, and try to help that person. Of course, you want to make sure this is an honorable thing that
Sure.
they're getting
That's good
into.
advice.
But I think that's I think that's a solid strategy. You know, get involved with somebody who does seem to know where they're going.
Yeah, that's great. Great strategy. And of course, you can never go wrong with read. Read everything you can get your hands on.
Yes.
Read history, read theology, read your Bible. That is preparation. That is not wasted time. So having a purpose, preparing for the purpose, even if you don't know what it is, and then placement, as you and I were talking about before. Um, Trying, working to position yourself so that when opportunity arises, you recognize the purpose and you're prepared for it. Getting informed, staying informed, staying engaged, whether that's farming or politics or whatever. Find a place to serve. If we're struggling with hopelessness, feelings of helplessness, depression, anxiety, whatever, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 3 says, "Commit your works unto the Lord, and your thoughts will be established." So our minds follow our bodies. Um, and so I would encourage folks who are struggling with that feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, find some place to serve, whether it's in your church, in your community, in your neighborhood, something. Do something to serve other people. That not only provides your purpose, it puts you in a place um, to do some good, to move the needle. In every area of involvement, focus on just doing the next right thing. I think that came out of the movie Frozen was the first time I heard that. Do the next right and tell the truth. It's revolutionary. Telling the truth is a revolutionary act in and of itself. And then be ready and watchful for whatever that moment is where your purpose is identified.
I'll say this too. If anybody's watching this and you have reached a sense of hopelessness, reach out to someone. And if you don't have anyone, hey, hit me up. I'm on Facebook, John Jones Music Maker at Gmail. If you need to contact me, don't let yourself keep going down this road of hopelessness, and know that I have absolutely been there. I get it. And I'll be glad to, meet with you on, in any way we can. And hopefully we can encourage one another. It's a scary place to get to, hopelessness, and I wouldn't want anybody else to get stuck in that.
I'll offer myself up to that as well. Anybody, I'm on Facebook. Feel free to reach out to me. Obviously, you found Fire for Effect. Drop us a comment there. We'll get in touch with you. Um, no one should feel alone, and we'll get that's one of the next things we'll talk about. But quickly before I get to that, in addition to having a purpose, being prepared, proper placement, persistence. We talked about this before. Keep going, even if it feels like we're failing. And that is much easier if you have a clear purpose in your mind. Uh, Winston Churchill also said another profound thing. He said that success is really just stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm.
I love it.
Much easier said than done. But the moment or that era that defines your finest hour, as Churchill said, may not even be readily apparent to you when it happens. You may not even see the success of your efforts in your lifetime, but it doesn't mean that you weren't important or that you weren't valuable. My favorite illustration of this is President John Quincy Adams. After he served as president, but then he lost his reelection bid to Andrew Jackson. And I think he's the only president to ever do this. After he served as president, he went back into Congress as a member of the House of Representatives and served there for, I think, the next 18 years. He was a very outspoken opponent of slavery, which was not a very popular view on that controversial political but very biblical issue of his day. John Quincy Adams was not successful in abolishing the institution of slavery during his lifetime. I think he passed away in 1848. However, even though he himself wasn't personally successful, he left a big impression on a junior congressman from Illinois,
Hmm.
who later became known as the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. So we may never see the success of our efforts in our lifetime. I hope we do. But who knows whether there is a future Lincoln who's watching your actions and listening to your words. So never underestimate your value, even if you don't see it readily apparent.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm just thinking of how it's really our job to go out and plant seeds and water them. We're not responsible for growing them. They may not produce the fruit we want to see in our lifetime, but I'm thinking of the people who, well, maybe I'll think of my own efforts in the farm direction again. I might not see what I want to see out of our efforts in my lifetime, but just trying to think beyond ourselves and being good stewards of what we have while we have it, I think is a great purpose for us to try to embrace.
Absolutely. And it's kind of liberating if you can embrace that mindset. Uh, again, something John Quincy Adams is famous for saying, that duty is ours, the results are God's.
Yeah,
And that is very liberating in my mind, that as long as I'm fulfilling my purposes, I'm doing all that I can. I'm doing what I know to be right and doing it to the best of my ability.
yeah.
That's all I'm responsible for.
And really and truly, man, this might get off in a whole nother direction here. I don't know, but um, if we're doing that, the crazy thought, if we're planting seeds and we're being the good stewards that we're supposed to be, a really humbling thought is that pleases God. Okay. But if we're doing what we're doing to please our own appetites, we'll never do it. We'll never actually fulfill our appetites and our desire for more. It'll just keep really growing into a bigger appetite. But if we do it with the steward mindset and just say, I'm here to be obedient, then we can actually accomplish that. It's an accomplishable goal. Whereas filling our own appetites and desires will never accomplish it. It never stops.
Yeah, that is a great point. So lastly here, for restoring hope and maintaining hope, we talked about it a little bit just a little bit ago, that personal connection, avoiding that feeling of isolation, knowing that you're not alone. Um, for the Christian, we take take a lot of comfort actually in the words of Jesus, again, right before he ascended back to heaven. The last thing he said to his disciples is, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen." And
Yes.
so we're literally never alone. But um, a human connection is also important. Realizing that you're not the only patriot, you're not the only Christian in the struggle for what is good and true and beautiful and virtuous. And reminding others that they are not alone either. Remember, other people are having the same hesitation and misgivings and doubts that you are. Connecting with and encouraging each other has never been more important, I believe. And I go back to Vietnam, a story that I read, prisoners of war during Vietnam. During the war, hundreds of American soldiers and airmen were captured and imprisoned in the North Vietnamese city of Hanoi. There's a very famous prison there. The Vietnamese called it Hoa Lo, the Hoa Lo prison, but that translates into English as fiery furnace. Interestingly enough, some Americans called it the Hell Hole, but it's most famously remembered by the name that the American prisoners gave it, the ironic name of the Hanoi Hilton. It wasn't a luxury hotel, that's for sure. Prisoners were kept there in isolation for years, chained to the floor, hung from rusty metal hooks. And in addition to extended solitary confinement, prisoners were regularly strapped down in iron stocks that were left over from the French colonial era. And they didn't fit well. Not that iron stocks ever really do, but it caused a lot of swelling. Skin would turn black. They were treated horribly. Each prisoner was alone and isolated in his cell, and as you would imagine, desperate for connection with their fellow prisoners, but never permitted to have any. And if you were caught trying, you would be punished severely. So the prisoners worked out a tap code where they could talk to each other via this tap code as a way to communicate in a way that wouldn't be obvious to the guards. One gentleman, Colonel Carlisle Smitty, he was an F-105 pilot. He said that anything we could do to make a sound, we would do it in tap code. We would sweep in tap code. We would cough in tap code. He said one time when he was outside chopping weeds, he would chop the weeds in tap code so that he could communicate with other prisoners. He said tap code had a cadence, and you would hear it and immediately listen. It gave us unity. We would tap poems, scripture, jokes, educational things. He said it kept us busy. It took a lot of time to communicate that way. He said, but it was one of the most constructive things that we could do. It was crucial to communicate, but difficult and dangerous. And if the guards heard tapping, the prisoners would be tortured. And he said often the guards would torture the prisoners in an attempt to extract useful information, and other times they would use them to make propaganda videos. But Colonel Harris said that there were times, too many to count, when a prisoner was taken from his cell, beaten and tortured mercilessly, and then tossed back into his cell. Those were the moments when the tap code brought comfort and compassion, when other POWs would tap GBU, GBU over and over, which means God bless you. Absolutely essential for us to know that we were not alone. So I'm going to play a portion of an interview that they did with Colonel Harris real quick.
Months later, I saw other POWs in separate cells. The guards went through the entire camp, one or two POWs at a time, and tortured us. Tried to make us say or do something, which we evaded as best we could. We couldn't do anything about that, absolutely no control. We did, however, use tap code to communicate. I was able to teach them the tap code. It just spread like wildfire. It was just morale to be able to talk to one of our buddies, exchange ideas, talk about our families, anything. Guys would come back from a torture session, put in solitary confinement, and would hear GBU in tap code. God bless you. It really helped people to know that the guys next to them had been through that too. It just helped us resist. But some of them died in captivity.
And that's some powerful stuff. Just, I guess that's one of those times where you can see both. In war, I would think, not that I've ever been, but in war, it seems that we see both the worst and the best of humanity. And that right there was obviously a dynamic mixture of both. One thought that I'll add real quickly about connecting with people is that a lot of us need to be aware of this temptation whenever we're feeling hopeless, this temptation to withdraw and conceal and disconnect from the world around us. I've seen it happen a couple of times in my personal life. I have faced that temptation myself. You know, nobody understands me. I'm just, I'm a victim of all whatever. Be aware of that in your own thinking. That is an absolute trap. That is an absolute trap. And it may require some vulnerability on your part to open up to somebody. And you'll probably open up to the wrong people a time or two. And that's going to be hurtful. But eventually, being vulnerable, being honest with people about what you're going through, what you're feeling, will bring you to some good, nourishing fellowship.
Yeah. I'm convinced that there are some people whose greatest superpower is their ability to encourage others. I think Colonel Harris will probably never know or understand the full extent of the encouragement, the hope that he provided to other prisoners in the Hanoi Hilton during the 8 years that he spent there himself. And notably, his opportunity to be that inspiration and encouragement, to be that hope, was only possible because he was in the prison too. He was in the same unfortunate circumstances. So So I would encourage us to not underestimate our value or our ability to inspire, to encourage other people, to give hope. We shouldn't fall into the mindset that we can't provide those things because we're going through a hard time ourselves. Colonel Harris was clearly having a very hard time himself, but he was still able to be an encouragement to others. And we might find that the very thing that gives us the opportunity to be impactful in another person's life, the very thing that gives us that opportunity is the unfortunate circumstances in which we find ourselves at any given moment. So I'm going to have to close it out here, John, but it's been a wonderful conversation. Just a quick review, reminding us all to do our best to be the beacons of hope in a world that's drowning in hopelessness. Be men and women of purpose with a strong sense of duty, to do the right thing and to do it right, everywhere, all the time, to the best of our abilities. Always be prepared, always be preparing, intentionally placing ourselves in position of service, being watchful and ready for opportunity, be persistent, even when success seems elusive, and connecting with and encouraging other people. Any parting thoughts?
I think that all sums it up nicely. I'll maybe just real quick mention a video I've seen recently of a nursing home where a lot of people, were in the final phases of life and obviously didn't have a high quality of life, but they brought in like toddler age, maybe 4 or 5-year-old kids to be with these people, and you could just see them light up. Now those kids couldn't physically do anything for these people, but they just brought with them hope. And maybe that's kind of to your point about just be an encouragement to somebody. Just be there.
Yeah. I have the privilege of serving in the nursing home ministry at my church. So there's a particular assisted living facility that I go to every month. And I can attest to that. The hope, the light that brings into their eyes and into their life. It's a blessing to me, for sure.
Man, hope is one of those words we can just take for granted so easily. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it so much.
Likewise, I appreciate your time on a Friday. I know you're a busy man, but I always appreciate your wisdom. I appreciate your questions. And for those who are listening, please follow us if you haven't already. We're on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, pretty much all of the platforms, Substack, Instagram, X. Follow us, give us a 5-star review if you can, drop a comment. If something that we've said has sparked something in your mind, another topic that you think would be interesting to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. Anything that you provide, we are interested in. So as I've said before, it fuels the fire and enhances the effect. And we look forward to seeing what you have to say about this, past and future episodes. John, it's been a pleasure, man, as always. Appreciate you, sir. God bless you.
Likewise.